Welcome to Bikerian.
Hello, I'm Aicila.
And I'm Eric. And this week we are going to be discussing sex tech, which is actually, we've been talking about this subject for a little while, and it's kind of evolved over the last few weeks and with some recent news, and it's really evolving. So this is about as cutting edge of a topic as we've done, because there's even a good chance by the time this recording goes live, something could have changed about it.
Yeah, it started with an article that went across my Facebook feed, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago, that caught my attention, and it was on human trafficking and the decriminalization of sex work. And the actual link that they've noted where when sex work is decriminalized, the human trafficking and the sexual human trafficking, it decreases. So there's a push for that. And I was like, well, I want to learn more about what they're talking about there. And in the midst of researching that, there's a recent piece of legislation passed called FOSTA, which is an extension of something called SESTA, or possibly have that backwards. And that the implications of that being passed have been rippling through our country in a variety of ways that people who have nothing to do with sex work or have anything to do with, what that looks like have experienced, such as Craigslist pulling down all of their personals, as well as some really bad impacts on people who do sex work and what they're dealing with. So it expanded from sort of this question around this article to the real impact right now. And also, why do you care? Like, if you aren't doing sex work and you're not paying in an illegal way for sex, then why do you care? And so that's the other piece to really talk about. And I have some points that I can bring into that.
Right. So one of the first things that I know you did, and I think this is a good starting point still for where we're at here, is to talk about some personal friends that you and I both know that call themselves and consider themselves sex workers.
Non-trafficked.
Non-trafficked.
I think that's an important point.
So, with the whole concept of decriminalizing sex work in general, one of the things that always comes to mind is that there seems to be a lot of moral opposition to that, unless you're just outside of Vegas where it's legal.
Right. And I did some research into the impact. So it's actually that it's not just outside of Vegas, it's anywhere in Nevada where the population is lower than 170,000 people.
Which covers pretty much all of the geography of Nevada, I promise.
I understand that. And just to be precise, I actually, before I looked into it, thought it was only one county. One county is very famous for it. However, any county that has fewer than 170,000 people is allowed to have brothels.
Right.
So it's the whole state except for Las Vegas, the city.
Yeah. That's the case as far as I know. Even I know there's a couple of places not too far from St. George, somewhere you're personally familiar with, just over the border.
And so it's also interesting to note that in terms of, we have a whole state where it's primarily legal, and there's really none of the impact that people are afraid of. Most of the articles that I read that had any kind of negative slant to it were from that, sort of stigma and the moral perspective of it's just wrong and this is why.
Right. And I think we can summarize the brief interviews, and, a lot of this is to protect the identities of the innocent, or not so innocent in this case. But, a lot of people find a lot of liberation in sex work. There's a lot of different reasons why some people would engage in that. I was even happy to see that, from the interview and from the information that we got, that a lot of these people are not even the type of people who end up being strippers or whatever, I'm going to school, or daddy hit me, or things like that. These are well-adjusted individuals that are capable of making an intelligent decision about how they want to use their body.
Right. And one of the points that I was in some of the research that I did that was brought up is that prostitution and sex work, legal sex work especially, is one of the highest paying jobs a woman can have in our society.
Right.
And so it's interesting the ways in which it is stigmatized and attempted to be controlled or stopped in some way without really allowing the people who are engaging in it to have a real voice. Like there's this whole concept of you're being exploited. And for sure there are people who are being exploited, and the people who are stepping forward and saying, no, I'm not being exploited. Their voice is actually not relevant as far as the legislators are concerned. Would you be willing to? So one of the people that I interviewed shared this actually, and it's the list of reasons that they chose sex work. And I really think it's just a good, quick summary of some things that people wouldn't necessarily think about.
So I will read it off of our little note sheet here. Reasons I choose sex work. Number 1, I need money. Number 2, I like money, not in the capitalist way mostly. Their words. Number 3, I can do the bulk of my work from home. Interesting concept. Number 4, I make my own hours. Number 5, I am disabled and cannot physically work 40-hour weeks outside of my home. So that's an interesting concept.
Mm-hmm.
Number 6, sleeping until 10 a.m. or noon. Number 7, taking pressure off me for needing to appear mentally well, put together, and healthy 90% of the time. Again, another thing I wouldn't have thought about.
Yeah.
Sex work offering you that ability. So interesting that they put that. Next, I can afford healthcare and my medications. So you mentioned it's a higher paying job than most. And so even though there's probably not too many benefits that come along with it, this person can afford their medications and healthcare.
Right.
I really enjoy being appropriately compensated for my sexuality since I live in a sexualized body and it always ends up being a part of my job whether I want it to be or not.
Mhm.
Interesting, and we could probably do a whole show on that concept alone.
It might be interesting to do.
It is the least stressful form of work I have found. They did note it's still pretty damn stressful, though.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last point that they made, I like other sex workers a lot and am proud to be one.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, all interesting concepts. And I think that the whole reason we had this in here was to sort of set the premise because we are talking about people who choose to do this.
Right.
But where we're really wanting to go with this and the whole reference to things going on in Nevada is about decriminalization for one specific purpose, which is actually the next point on our notes here.
Well, and so there's this complexity around the sex work. There's stigma. There's the moral majority or whatever they're called these days. And then there's people who are engaging in it who have been forced into sexual slavery, either in some very like movie-esque way, right?
So Taken.
There we go. Or they're engaging in what one of the people that I interviewed called survival sex, where they trade sex for things they need. And one of the interviews that I read actually on Medium talked about how, yes, actually I have done that. And it wasn't less degrading to me than other options. And I needed to serve, like we live in a capitalist society, you need money to do things. This was a way available to me. And what consistently you find across the spectrum of people who are participating in the sex industry in some way or another is that the online avenues really increase the quality of life for a lot of sex workers in that they had a lot more control over what they did and who they did with it. They did it with. They had a lot more control over how much money they made. And the online operators, the platforms, because of, so in the Communications and Decency Act, there is a section 230 that is about not holding platforms liable for third-party content. And so that basically created a space where people could, like Craigslist, or this one place called Backpage, which was primarily for escort and adult entertainment services. They could sort of allow for people to post their advertising or their invitations to customers and clients without being held liable for whether or not that was legal or not. However, so that's what 230 did, protected them. And additionally, however, it was a pretty narrow bandwidth in that, like, for instance, Backpage, which is one of the sites that was seized like 3 days ago because of this law. About 3 weeks ago, a court ruled that Backpage was liable for some of the things on their site that they had altered in certain ways. So the sites that were supporting trafficking and some of these things that they're saying they want to prevent by FOSTA, SESTA, were already liable under the law as it was. And what occurred before was that there was a strong encouragement, and a lot, because it was visible, sort of the argument of the people who are anti-trafficking and were very much also anti this bill, the experts who work in the field, right? They were like, here's the deal. These online platforms are currently the best way for us to find people who are engaging in trafficking. It's also the best way for people who are engaging in escort services and prostitution to find clients. However, the more visible they are, the more easily we can also find the people who are being exploitive and abusive.
Got it. So what I'm hearing here, it sounds like the real issue is that now that these legal sites that were perhaps promoting slightly less than legal activities, but were doing it with people that were willing to do it, by taking them down, we're now taking away an easy way to track people that are doing the, I think everyone would agree, far worse illegal activity of human trafficking.
Right. The people who were engaging in human trafficking were also using these sites. However, I guess there were ways that you could identify that behavior. Like, and so both law enforcement as well as the web platforms themselves, they would engage in filtering behaviors, and they would identify like, oh, these folks over here. And obviously not all of the sites were as responsible. However, for the most part, a lot of times what the anti-human trafficking activists were saying is that a lot of times they were able to catch people doing this because of these sites and their forms of self-regulation, and they then would report things. So now we've got things like Craigslist has shut down itself.
Their personal ads.
Sorry, thank you for the clarification. And so where that was noticeable, anyone who was using that site, either for trafficking or for their own business, now has to go somewhere else. And if there's been a domino effect, I guess a lot of sites have been either taken down or shut themselves down. So one of the people that I interviewed or talked to about this, I should say it wasn't as formal as an interview, has said that one of the sites that a lot of sex workers use to report abusive clients and note, like, these are the people that you really want to avoid for whatever reason, that site also has taken itself down. So there's a resource that's no longer available.
So aside from the tech aspect of all of this feels very much like the war on drugs.
Yeah.
The more that they push, the more that they think that it will help to get rid of these avenues, the more it moves underground.
And the more dangerous it becomes for everybody.
Including the sex workers that choose to do this versus the ones that don't.
Right. And and the interesting thing, so and I will obviously have all this in the show notes, is that we saw with, like, you, and even you noted this when we were talking before, that the sort of trajectory of the war on drugs is pretty similar, where they, and in some ways we're facing it now. Like, Sessions has said he's going to go after the states that have legalized pot.
Yeah, all multiples, 10 to 12, I think, right now, including, and of course, we're in Colorado. Recreational pot is legal, and it has ended society as we know it by creating so many jobs and such a good economy that it's impossible to get anywhere in town because of all the new traffic for people that have moved here. So
and the increase in taxes such that they had to send us a refund last year because they
overtaxed us and gave all that money to schools. So, I mean, again, another show topic here to debate, legalization of drugs. But in this case, legalization of sex work would make it very hard for sex trafficking to occur. And instead, the laws are actually making it more of an underground, hidden thing, something that has to be done on the dark web or some variant of it.
Yes.
And, with everybody on the dark web on VPNs and stuff, now all of a sudden there's no IP tracking and stuff like that. To be honest, these avenues were fantastic for catching these people because most people are idiots. They don't realize. And the dark web's obviously been a place where you can buy drugs or probably participate in sexual trafficking and that sort of thing. But most people don't know how to do that. Now they're going to learn because they don't have a choice.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen. And the thing that's even more concerning to me, so in a step, so California drafted a bill recently based, I think, on what's happening with SESTA and FOSTA, to expand the definition of pandering. So pandering is when you support somebody else in prostitution in some way, like that
Right.
you're, so, but they're expanding that. So, but prior to this rewrite of this bill or this law, it was, and hopefully by the time we air this show, this will be a non issue. However, it's just an example of how these things can really snowball, in that this new bill is defining pandering as and taking it beyond receiving a gift or, because people don't usually say it's compensation. So if I'm trying to convince you to prostitute yourself so that I can have some money and I support you or pressure you or exploit you into that, and then you give me a financial gift that I pandered you, and then I can be held liable for that, right?
Right.
In this expansion, it's if the ways in which you can contribute to someone's prostitution, and if you don't receive, you don't necessarily have to receive a gift, and the way it's written, like if you give someone a condom and then they use that in their prostitution activity, you could actually be considered it could be considered pandering.
Wow.
And that's kind of, because I'm thinking about like, well, what about all the safer sex places and the places that are trying to reduce HIV? It's like, that's a nightmare.
Right.
And there's a part of me that says, well, that's nutty, right? Like, no one's going to go that far. Except I remember when the Defense of Marriage Act was getting passed all over the country. And when Ohio passed it, they passed such an extreme version that it made it illegal for a woman who was not married to report a man who was not her husband for domestic violence. Oh,
Wow.
yeah. No, it was written so extremely that you couldn't receive the benefit of marriage, and domestic violence rules, or I guess domestic violence rules were primarily written around spouses. So someone who was living with someone who beat them up and they could prove it, if they weren't married, it was not actually illegal. And this guy beat his wife and he was charged with it, or his girlfriend. And they went through the whole Supreme, it took like 3 or 4 years for them to finally say, oh, wait a minute. No, that's not really what we meant. And so there's this part of me that's like, oh, no one's ever going to charge somebody for pandering because they gave them a condom for safer sex. And I'm like, well, but that happened in Ohio. And that was maybe 8 years ago. So it's not like it was 40 years ago. Oh, we're more enlightened. So when people are talking about this, I'm like, wow, like this is not good.
I really agree, and I'm kind of surprised because these are articles you have found, and you'll link to them obviously, but this isn't front page news anywhere. I mean, there's so
Mm-mm.
much front page news with other things. One of the biggest things that's been going on for the last several weeks has been the Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing.
Right.
Zuckerberg recently testified in front of Congress to try to justify their business practices. I work in the internet biz directly, with a company that's a partner with Google, so I'm very familiar with all of this. People don't understand that monetization on the net is based on advertising and that sort of thing, but they start to just see these different services. And in this case, these are people that were, engaging in what to the letter of the law is illegal, and it will get shut down if it's caught. But I never heard about too many busts going on Craigslist or anything like that. Now, with new laws in place, one thing about a new law that I've learned in my years on this planet is that it generally draws attention to it. So it is closing these sites down. I think we're going to see sites that are more like torrent sites such as Pirate Bay, which has been shut down how many times in multiple different countries. I mean, to my knowledge, they might be broadcasting that site from a boat somewhere, like pirate radio style. People find a way. They find a way to do this stuff, these illegal activities that have a demand. There's not even monetization in piracy.
Right.
And if you add money into the equation here, and that's what we have, especially for sex traffickers that are clearly, doing what they're doing because it's lucrative. So selling people that you basically own as slaves makes them enough money to offset the potential fears they would have of, being caught and the repercussions. But it's very concerning, that's for sure.
And the thing that you're seeing, like with Craigslist shutting down and some of these other sites voluntarily shutting themselves down, is they don't want to be the first test case. They don't want the liability of it. The expanded liability in this new act means that in addition to any criminal charges that can be filed, you're also open to civil charges.
Right.
So you could be sued. And there's a way in which, once again, it's very interesting. Like, it sounds good on the surface. Yay, we want to stop children being forced into sex. Everybody's on board with that.
Right.
There's no, and yet, what they've done is very effectively also create quite a dangerous environment for a lot of people who were functioning well in their situation and had chosen the situation. In addition to that, another law was added to a recent bill around taxes called it was a cloud law, and it makes it so that if your information, so some sex workers, for example, would store their information on a server in another country, and in order for the government to access that information, they have to go through a treaty process and file a request. And that's what they're going through with Microsoft right now. They want to get information on someone in another country. And so Microsoft was saying, no, you have to go through this process. You can't just get it. You have to actually follow your own laws. Well, they passed a law that says, oh, no, never mind. And they just threw it in, like no one's talking about this one either. If your information's in a cloud server is based in another country, they can just go get it, and they don't have to tell you they don't need a warrant. They don't have to tell you're under investigation. So this thing that Microsoft is fighting, now they can just go do it. Circumvent.
Wow. Yeah, I did not hear about that. And again, I work in the internet biz. There's new legislation coming in the next couple of weeks in Europe called GDPR. And long story short, it's probably one of the most sweeping privacy law changes that the tech and internet industry has seen ever. I can tell you that I've gotten notifications from several services that my company uses, and I know that my company itself is scrambling to meet these requirements, because imagine a world where not only do you have the cookie notification that you have to have on a European website, so it informs you that the site uses cookies, and right now you just click OK and it goes away. Soon you're going to have to be able to select what information you're willing to share and keep on your computer in that cookie, and they have to give you the options for it. And there's a whole lot of back-end privacy knowledge type issues with all of this. The best case in point I can give is that one company that stores information for its users that sign up, it just collects information. If a user is not logged into that site for 9 months, they're going to delete it automatically. It's the easiest way to avoid it, because they are facing up to $2 million in fines for any company that violates GDPR. So you can imagine the seriousness. And with a number that big, they're looking at things like Google and Facebook and that sort of thing. So it's funny, because with all the Facebook talk and this cloud law that you're talking about right now, soon one of the repercussions of this law is that you can contact any company and have them completely remove all of your information, period. And they have to do it in compliance. So it's interesting, because this European law is going to make it so that people can store their information there. And if they get a whiff that somebody might be trying to pull that information off of those servers, you can request to have it removed and it will be gone completely. I'm literally putting this together just based on the fact that this is my day job
Mhm.
is dealing with GDPR right now. And what you're talking about, like circumventing, it could literally be a race between the person with the information and the government trying to get the information, because by law in Europe, that company's going to have to delete that information when the user requests it pretty much immediately.
Wow. Well, in some ways, it's reassuring that, and so one of the questions that I feel like comes up when we have conversations around something like this is, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why do you care? Right. And there's a lot of reasons to care besides self interest. However, let's start there, which is that a lot of countries, like we like to think of ourselves in America as being a democratic, free society. And a lot of countries have found, governments have found that they can censor their country really well by using laws like this, using the internet to control the population. And there's this really great article in the Columbia Journalism Review, and I looked up sort of what they talked about with China, because I thought that was very interesting. That most of us would agree that China is fairly censored. It has the most internet users and the fastest growing connected population in the world, and it has the most ambitious censorship of any country. And what's very interesting is that, okay, so they said this was 3 years ago, so these numbers have changed, but of the 3 billion internet users in the world, 22% live in China, nearly 10% live in the US. And the government maintains the Great Firewall to block unacceptable content, including foreign news. An estimated 2 million censors police the internet and the activities of the users. The BBC reported in 2014 that 76% of the Chinese questioned said they felt free from government surveillance. And this was the highest rate of the 17 countries that they polled.
I mean, that can't be true. There's 2 million people paying attention to everything.
But they feel completely free. And I think that's part of why, so it's interesting because I started out with this, how would decriminalization help people who are being trafficked, which is horrifying. And of course, we don't want to see happen. And as we're going through and I'm like, wow, it's that old quote, that first they came for the Jews and I wasn't one. And they came for the gypsies and I was and then they came for me. And sex workers are very vulnerable. There's a huge stigma against sex work. There's a huge stigma in our country, honestly, about breaking the law. So targeting these people and making it so that it's harder for them to do their job and be safe is a great first step if you are wanting to create a fervor towards censorship. And it's terrifying to me.
Yeah.
It's terrifying to me. Whatever your position is on whether or not this is appropriate or good, as a country that wants to be a bastion of light and liberty, we really need to stand up and look at what we're allowing in the name of some sort of weird moral reaction and a fear. I agree. There's this weird thing that happened with the Russians in the election, and penduluming over to try and shut down. And we're not going to be able to shut down the freedom of the internet, but we could really become like China and have it highly censored and not know.
It comes down to this. The internet is a very powerful tool, and we have talked many times about how it's a double-edged sword, positives and negatives, definitely not always used for good. But what it has done is it has made certain things easier to come by, whether that's paying somebody for sex or, buying a car or
Inexpensive peacock feathers when you want to make a peacock cloak.
I mean, it is a powerful tool. And here's the thing. What it's going to force us to do is stop looking at how to regulate the internet other than maybe stricter privacy laws. I think I'm all for that. It's the backlash of GDPR is that these companies that operate out of the US, in order to continue with the large market that is Europe, they're just changing their laws. We all benefit from these privacy laws.
Oh, for sure. I think it's a great, I will say, I go back and forth because on one hand, I'm like, I just love the convenience of everything being stored in the cloud. And I recognize that there's a way in which I've paid a price for the convenience. And I think
You
as a
have to assume that every bit of that information is public.
exactly. And I feel like that's something that as a country, as a population, we're coming to terms with together.
The other side of that, and where I think the real point of this show really hinges on, is that certain things that are victimless crimes, which, again, I could speak at length about my feelings on victimless crimes being, a meaningless pursuit for legal and state government, to go
Yeah.
after. Is it worth trying to regulate things to death, chase them deeper into the underground where they can just get scarier, or just start legalizing things that aren't that bad in an effort to take away the motivation? If drugs and sex are legal, we don't have to worry about fighting them. There's ramifications there. I understand that. But in all honesty, we are getting to a world where it's easy to get what you want. And the harder they try to make it, the more salacious it's going to become.
Yeah. And I'll end with that the Journal of Ethics, published by the AMA, strongly recommends, as of January of 2017, the decriminalization of sex work in an attempt to promote health among marginalized populations and to limit or stop human trafficking as a key strategy.
That sounds like people smarter than me might agree with what I just said.
Good point. Hello, welcome to this week's Bicurian Moment. Eric's going to start us off.
I am. So over the last couple of weeks and month, really, there's been a lot of talk about Facebook after they violated everybody's user information. And what's really funny about it is I don't even see that they really violated it. They just didn't really regulate who was getting access to it. So people took some personality profiles and suddenly their information was used in the Trump campaign. And nobody was real thrilled about that.
Yeah, and personally, I think it's a really good question around how private do we really think the internet is? Like if you post something, generally I feel like if I put something on the internet, I should be prepared to see it show up somewhere sometime.
So I feel the exact same way. Like I just don't do anything on the internet that I am not willing to have be out there somewhere. I'm not a hardcore privacy person. I like to protect my identity and do those basic sorts of things, but I also just don't give information that I wouldn't want out public.
I take a different tact, which is I just feel like I'm so insignificant. No one really cares what I'm doing. But
Which is true. And that's where the thing with this Facebook, in the Cambridge Analytica
there's
came
a flaw in my thinking that has been pointed out by the situation.
Well, and even more so, you don't necessarily know the ways in which it's going to get used because now you were statistical data when you signed up for that. And that's almost just as bad, I think. So if you end up as a statistic on things like that because they were able to sample the population and use that information to help get somebody elected or something like that, it's just, I don't know. The internet's not a safe place, and people assume that it is, and they take the cute little things. And so seeing everybody talking about deleting Facebook and all of that, I really have a hard time not, supporting that to an extent. If you can't respect your own privacy enough and pay attention to what you're doing, you're safer if you do delete it. So it's just something I've been thinking about because social media, I have a love-hate relationship with social media in that I think it has a lot of power to be very destructive, but it's also useful to keep in touch and maintain friendships and things like that. It's just been a really interesting debate for me. So this one might just be this one might just be setting up a show topic for later on.
Yeah, actually, I think it would be kind of fun to talk about what are the pros and cons or the benefits and drawbacks
and the real expectations of internet privacy.
Internet and social media. Like there have been so many studies that have shown how people on social media being upset causes you to be upset. Like,
oh yeah, FOMO.
Yeah. Like
I don't
there's
think
it's just really, I mean, it's a very complex neurological experiment that we are participating in without really understanding what's happening.
exactly. So it's my Bicurian moment. More of something that I've just been thinking about a lot lately, and the ramifications of all of it.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good one. Very relevant. And I definitely think we should do a show on that. Mine is one that we're going to do a show on, kind of talking about the complexity of gender. And there's an article about a trans man who had a baby that was published recently in the Guardian. And it's not the first trans man I've actually known to have a baby. However, it is something that isn't often talked about, is when we think about transitioning, people often think, oh, we have to be one or the other. We're very
Right. Binary.
And I think it was really brave for this person to share their story of that complexity, in that they wanted to have biological child, and they still acknowledge that their gender was male. And what does that look like in terms of that experience? So I definitely want to delve deeper into it, but I just wanted to share that Bicurian moment for
Yeah.
today.
No, that's great. I'm very much looking forward to that, and I think it's something we could have a lot of fun with on a show.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Well, thanks for listening this week. Please feel free to give us comments and all of that in the forum below, and we look forward to hearing from you listeners.
Very much so. Have a good day.